He said he was tired. Said this wasn't the life he wanted anymore. I was sitting on the couch, still physically weak from the surgery 3 weeks prior. The kids were in the next room, close enough to hear everything if voices rose. They didn't. His tone stayed calm, almost kind, like he was explaining a necessary inconvenience. There's someone else, he said. I can't do this anymore. I nodded because my body didn't have the energy to do anything else. Then, without pausing, he shifted immediately to logistics. Who would handle mornings? Which days he could still help with pickups? When he'd be available for appointments? He was leaving emotionally and physically in the same breath, but framing it like a transition plan. Like love could be replaced with scheduling. He walked out that night. I sat there alone, listening to the kids brush their teeth upstairs, and realized something had shifted. Love had ended. Responsibility hadn't. It had just been dumped entirely onto me. He came back for his clothes 2 days later. Moved efficiently through the house, filling duffel bags with shirts, shoes, chargers. He took his income, his flexibility, his ability to leave when things felt hard. I kept the kids, the recovery timeline my doctor had mapped out, the endless schedule of meals and homework and bedtime routines. He said it was temporary. That once I was stronger, things would balance out. He said I was strong, like it was a compliment instead of a sentence. I didn't argue. I watched him carry boxes to his car and drive away, leaving behind 2 children who didn't understand why Dad wasn't staying for dinner. That night, I realized what he'd actually done. Emotional abandonment had become a logistical burden. And I was expected to carry it quietly, without complaint, because asking for help now felt like proving I couldn't handle what he'd left behind. The first gap appeared on a Tuesday. He was supposed to pick up the kids at 4. I had a follow-up appointment scheduled, something I couldn't reschedule without losing weeks of waiting. At 3:50, my phone buzzed. Work ran late. Can you handle it today? He sounded apologetic. Not defensive, just regretful, like circumstances had simply gotten away from him. I canceled the appointment. The kids waited by the window for 20 minutes before I told them Dad wasn't coming. They didn't cry. They just went back to their rooms. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, understanding something new. His absence wasn't emotional anymore. It was operational. He wasn't avoiding feelings. He was avoiding responsibility. And every gap he left, I filled. Quietly. Efficiently. Without making it his problem. That was the moment I realized absence had become a tool. And I was the one making it work. After that, he started checking in instead of showing up. Texts arrived regularly, polite and concerned. How are you feeling? Kids doing okay? Need anything? He framed distance as maturity, like giving me space was somehow thoughtful. But when I asked if he could take the kids Thursday so I could rest, he'd hesitate. Let me check my schedule. I'll let you know. He never committed up front. Everything became conditional, dependent on whether it fit into a life I was no longer part of. When he did show up, he stayed surface level. Asked the kids about school but didn't help with homework. Commented on how tired I looked but didn't offer to cook dinner. Care had been replaced with courtesy. And courtesy, I learned, doesn't feed children or fold laundry or sit with a 7-year-old who's confused about why their family fell apart. It just makes the person offering it feel better about doing nothing. I still needed help. My body was healing slower than expected. Lifting anything heavier than a gallon of milk sent sharp pain through my abdomen. I couldn't drive for more than 20 minutes without exhaustion setting in. So I asked, can you take them to practice Saturday? Can you handle breakfast pickup Sunday? Can you cover bedtime Friday so I can sleep? He said yes. Then he'd text an hour before. Something came up. Can we push it? Or he'd arrive late, cutting the time so short it barely mattered. Pickups shifted. Meals I'd planned around his help had to be reworked. Rides I'd arranged got cancelled last minute, leaving me scrambling to find another parent who could cover. And every time, he apologized. But apologies didn't change the pattern. Dependency had set in, and he controlled when help arrived. That was the shift. Support had become conditional. And I was learning to function in the gaps he left. I found out about his new life through a mutual friend. She mentioned seeing him at a coffee shop, same time every morning, always organized, always on schedule. His routine there had structure. Fixed plans. Reliability. He showed up to work on time, met friends for drinks, attended weekend events without canceling. None of that consistency reached my household. When I needed him Tuesday at 6, he'd text at 5:45. When the kids had a dentist appointment he'd agreed to handle, he'd forget until I reminded him twice. His calendar worked perfectly for his new life. It just didn't include us. That's when I understood. Abandonment wasn't random. It was selective. He had time. He had energy. He had reliability. He simply chose where to spend it. And we were no longer the priority. That realization settled in my chest, cold and clear. This wasn't about capacity. It was about choice. The messages started coming through the kids. My son, 9 years old, would relay information like a tiny secretary. Dad said maybe tomorrow. Dad said he's busy. Dad said he'll try. I didn't ask him to do that. Neither did his father. But somehow, communication had shifted. Instead of texting me directly, he'd mention things to the kids, knowing they'd pass it along. It was subtle. Not malicious on the surface. But it put them in the middle. They became conduits, carrying his uncertainty, his apologies, his last-minute changes. And when plans fell through, they felt it personally. My daughter asked once if Dad didn't want to see them anymore. I said that wasn't true, but I didn't know how to explain what was actually happening. That their father had turned them into messengers because it was easier than being accountable to me. That's when the shift became dangerous. The kids weren't just watching the gap. They were bridging it. A school obligation was missed in October. A parent-teacher conference I'd assumed he was handling because he'd said, "I'll take care of it." He didn't. The record reflected my absence. The teacher followed up gently, concerned, asking if everything was okay at home. I apologized, embarrassed, and rescheduled. Later that evening, he forwarded me the original notice. Just wanted to make sure you saw this. No acknowledgement that he'd agreed to go. No apology for the confusion. Just a subtle reminder that the responsibility ultimately sat with me. That was the moment I realized consequences were attaching to my name. Not because I was failing, but because he could let things drop and I'd be the one left explaining why. The system assumed I was the primary. The default. And he'd learned he could operate in the margins, showing up when convenient, disappearing when it wasn't, while I absorbed every gap as personal failure. When I finally asked for consistency, he reframed it. "Are you feeling overwhelmed?" He asked gently. "Is this too much for you right now?" Like my request for reliability was actually a cry for help. Like wanting him to follow through on commitments meant I was struggling to cope. He suggested I talk to someone. A therapist, maybe. Someone who could help me manage stress. He wasn't dismissive. He was concerned, which made it worse. Because concern implies care. And care implies I was the problem, not his behavior. When I pressed, asking him to commit to fixed days, he sighed. "I'm doing my best. I don't think you realize how hard this is for me too." And just like that, my need for structure became evidence of my weakness. My vulnerability was reframed as incompetence. And I was left wondering if I was asking for too much, if my expectations were unreasonable, if I should just be grateful for whatever scraps of involvement he offered. I stopped correcting him verbally. Stopped explaining why last-minute changes hurt the kids. Stopped filling gaps with emotion, trying to make him understand what this was doing to all of us. When he texted that he couldn't make Tuesday, I replied, understood. When he asked if I was upset, I said, no. When he offered vague plans for next time, I didn't respond. Silence wasn't strategy yet. It was exhaustion. I didn't have the energy to keep arguing with someone who reframed every boundary as an attack. But something shifted in that silence. Without my reactions, his behavior became more visible. There was no emotion to deflect onto. No anger he could call unreasonable. No frustration he could dismiss. Just his words, sitting in the thread, uncontested. And slowly, I started noticing patterns I'd been too tired to see before. The same excuses. The same timing. The same gaps, repeating like a script he didn't realize he was following. All communication moved to writing. I stopped taking his calls. Stopped accepting verbal promises. Everything went through text or email. Same tone. Same structure. Dates. Times. Confirmation requests. No commentary. No emotion. Just facts. Can you take the kids Saturday, 3 to 7? He'd reply, should work. I'd respond, I need a yes or no by Thursday. If he missed the deadline, I made other plans. If he canceled last minute, I documented it. Sent a brief follow-up. You were scheduled for Saturday 3 to 7. Kids were ready. You didn't arrive. No accusations. No anger. Just record keeping. At first, he didn't notice the shift. But over time, the tone changed his responses. He started confirming earlier. Apologizing more carefully. Offering explanations I didn't ask for. Because written words don't disappear. They don't get reinterpreted. And suddenly, memory had become record. Everything he said, everything he promised, lived permanently in a thread he couldn't edit or deny. Patterns emerged in the data. Late pickups repeated every second week. Same reasons. Same phrasing. Work conflict. Traffic. Last-minute obligation. The timing was almost predictable. He'd confirm enthusiastically early in the week, then cancel Thursday or Friday. When he did show up, it was often 15 to 30 minutes late. Not enough to be dramatic. Just enough to destabilize my schedule. At first, I thought it was carelessness. Then I realized it was control. He wasn't disorganized. His new life ran smoothly. Fixed coffee times. Regular work hours. Planned social events. The chaos only appeared in his interactions with us. And chaos, I'd learned, is hard to argue against. It looks like circumstances. Like bad luck. Like life just happening. But when you document it, patterns emerge. Emotional abandonment had a schedule now. And once I could see it clearly, I could measure it. That shift changed everything. Because measurable behavior can be addressed. And addressed behavior can be stopped. I proposed fixed custody times in November. Fixed locations for pickup. No swaps unless requested in writing 72 hours ahead. He agreed immediately. Sounded relieved, even. Yeah, structure is good. Let's do that. The first week, he missed Sunday pickup. Texted at noon that something came up. The second week, he arrived 40 minutes late to Wednesday exchange. No explanation. Just a casual apology. By the third week, the pattern was undeniable. He'd agreed to structure but had no intention of following it. Because structure without consequences is just a suggestion. And he'd spent months learning I wouldn't enforce boundaries. That I'd absorb his gaps quietly. That flexibility was my responsibility, not his. But this time I didn't adjust. Didn't cover. Didn't make it work. When he missed pickup, the kids stayed home. When he arrived late, I noted the time. Non-compliance had become visible. And visibility, I realized, was the first step toward accountability. I filed for legal separation in December. Didn't argue abandonment in the paperwork. Didn't write paragraphs about emotional harm or broken promises. I submitted evidence of inconsistency. Custody schedules with his confirmations and cancellations side by side. School records showing missed obligations. Text threads demonstrating pattern behavior. My attorney organized it cleanly. Dates. Times. Documented failures to appear. The emotional weight stayed implied but undeniable. When he received the filing, he called immediately. "This is extreme. We can work this out." But his voice carried something new. Not anger. Uncertainty. Because for the first time, his behavior had consequences he couldn't apologize away. The court didn't care about his reasons. Didn't care that work ran late or traffic was bad. It cared about outcomes. And the outcomes were documented. Systems had replaced appeals. And systems, unlike me, didn't forgive patterns. They measured them. Then they enforced accountability. The court enforced structure in January. Fixed custody hours. Written change requests only, submitted 5 days in advance. No last-minute swaps. No verbal agreements. Violations documented and reviewed quarterly. He tried to negotiate flexibility during the hearing. Said strict schedules didn't account for real life. The judge listened, then referenced the 6 months of records I'd submitted. "Mr. Patterson," she said, "the schedule exists because informal arrangements weren't honored." He didn't argue after that. The order was signed. Custody became predictable. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 to 8. Every other weekend, Friday 6 p.m. to Sunday 6 p.m. If he couldn't make it, he notified me in writing or the time was forfeited. No guilt. No scrambling. No kids waiting by the window. Within 2 weeks, he was compliant. Not because he'd changed. Because non-compliance now had consequences that affected him directly. Control had ended. Not through confrontation or anger. Through structure. And structure, I learned, doesn't need emotion to work. It just needs enforcement. The kids stopped waiting by the window. They knew when he was coming because the schedule told them. No more maybe tomorrow or Dad said he'll try. Just fixed times they could rely on. The house became quieter. Not sad. Stable. My recovery finished without interruption. I returned to work part-time, then full-time. The custody arrangement held. He showed up on time now. Not out of care, but out of obligation. And obligation, it turned out, worked just as well. Sometimes better. I don't think about him much anymore. Not with anger or longing. Just clarity. He didn't lose control because he was cruel. He lost it because he couldn't follow his own schedule. And once I stopped filling his gaps, the gaps became his problem. That was the lesson. You can't manipulate someone who stops reacting. You can't control someone who documents instead of argues. And you can't abandon someone who's already let you go.